Grant. Thank you very much for coming, ladies and gentlemen. Really appreciate this turnout. Once upon a time, the term news media was simply unknown. It used to be newspapers, because that's all there was. Then came radio. Then in the mid-20th century came TV. So the term was then invented, news media, to cover both newspapers and broadcasting. But just in the last decade or two, how different it's all become with the discovery of a new beast called the internet. And nowadays, news can be published in a huge variety of ways. Websites, chat rooms, message boards, blogs. Some of the bigger bloggers don't just comment on news, they actually break it as well. So what a rich environment this now is. And of course, all the media platforms borrow from each other, as you would expect. And if an important news item arises, it's broken in one source and quickly spreads to the others. So you can pick it up on a whole range of different formats. And people have their own preferred formats that they like to use. People with iPads might go to the website straight away, and so on. More than that, if you look these days at the websites of the major newspapers and broadcasters, they look pretty much the same. Even the broadcast websites now have text. The newspaper websites have video. They both have pictures. And sometimes it's a matter of choice, really, whether you go to the newspaper website or the TV one, because they look and do very much the same sort of a job. This is what we call convergence. Now, this has raised two questions, and these are the two questions the government's asked us to answer. In this modern environment, how do you legally define the term news media? Because you have to, because as Sir Grant said, the news media have certain legal privileges and responsibilities which set them apart from anybody else. Only the news media can sit in closed court when the public are throwing out, and the media cannot be ejected, the news media. They're exempt from the Privacy Act, or most of its principles. They have special exemptions too under the Fair Trading Act. Now, real question in this day and age, to whom do those privileges belong? What are the news media for that purpose? Now, to answer it, you simply have to say, well, those privileges don't exist for the media's own benefit. They exist for the public benefit. And it's to make sure that there's a proper flow of information, that courts and others are held accountable in the public interest. Now, if they're doing that job for the public, there's got to be responsibility attached to it too. And one expects, and the courts have occasionally said, they expect fair and responsible reporting, correction of mistakes, proper balance, and so on. In other words, the good old-fashioned principles of good journalism. And this leads us into a far wider principle, which goes beyond the privileges. We think that in any democratic society, there has to be a body of media on whom the public can rely to give accurate information about what's going on in the world today. Somewhere you can go and say, well, look, if that's wrong, it will be corrected. We know it's pretty right, and we can rely on it to exercise our democratic rights, such as the right to vote. There's got to be a body of such media. And we think the only way you can assure that is to say that that body of media should have a code of ethics and be responsible to a complaints body, so people can complain to that body if something goes wrong, and that it can be put right. So we've taken that as our definition of news media for the purpose of the law. News media who demonstrate responsibility by having a code of ethics and being subject to a complaints body. Now that raises the next question, which is far harder than the first one. The first one was bad enough, but the second one is very much harder. And it simply is, what sort of complaints body are we talking about? And I'm going to call it from now on a standards body, because that's really what it is. Presently, there are two. The Press Council deals with newspapers, and the Broadcasting Standards Authority deals with newspapers. Deals with broadcasters. And when I say the BSA deals with broadcasters, I mean precisely that. It deals only with broadcasts and nothing else. Now, I'm going to demonstrate shortly that the broadcasters originally got together and are about to create a new body called OMSA, the Online Media Standards Authority, and I'll come back to that. But presently, in operation, it's just the Press Council and the Broadcasting Standards Authority. Now, with that current arrangement, there are two quite serious problems, really. First is, there's an awful lot of gaps in the system. Broadcasters' own websites are not subject to any regulation at all. The BSA deals only with broadcasts, and websites are not broadcasters. There are many other little websites. There are bloggers who are not regulated in any way at all. So the current system is full of gaps. The Press Council is able to, and occasionally does, look at newspaper websites, but that's all. So that's the first problem. The second is that the current system is piecemeal and inconsistent because the Press Council and the BSA are totally different bodies. The BSA is a statutory body. Appointments to it are made by the government. It operates statutory standards and it can impose statutory sanctions and remedies, including quite heavy costs. The Press Council is entirely a voluntary self-regulatory body. It can find a newspaper has infringed, but has no power to award money or any other sorts of remedy at the moment. It could perhaps extend if it wanted to, but currently it's just a finding that one is in breach or not. But the real difference is it's a self-regulatory voluntary body. Now, taking the point before that there is convergence, and you get the same news now from a whole variety of sources, can you really justify two such entirely different bodies doing that job? Now, to come back to OMSA, the Online Media Standards Authority, this is the broadcasters' recent initiative, and they have launched the system, but it's not yet operating. It will be in a month or so, I gather. They will cover, in much the same way as the Press Council does, broadcasters' websites. So they'll plug that gap. And as I read their terms of reference, they will maybe extend to other websites as well. We congratulate them on that initiative. That does go some of the way, that they'll be plugging gaps. But the other major problem, it seems to us, is not being resolved by it, and that's the convergence and inconsistency problem. Because from now on, you're going to have three bodies doing the same sort of a job, not just two, and all doing it in different ways. Different complaints bodies. So you've got to complain 3 times if you've been affected by all the media. You might get a different outcome, different remedies, applying different codes. And it seems to us that that is not very user-friendly. It's also not very efficient, and it's also not very cost-effective. So what we would like to see, and what we think is inevitable in the long run, in this area of convergence, is a single converged regulator, a one-stop shop. So if I've had unkind things said about me in all branches of the media, and it's gone viral, I make one complaint to this one-stop shop. It'll be dealt with in a consistent way across all the media, and what matters is the content of the statement and not the platform it was delivered from. That, it seems to us, is much more user-friendly. That's consumer front. That's consumer-friendly. It's also, we believe, far more effective and simple. So we are recommending a single regulator, and I don't like using the term regulator, that's not quite what it is. It's a single standards body. We've got a nice new name for it. We call the News Media Standards Authority, NMSA for short. Whether that will take hold, I don't know. But you've got to have an acronym. So that's our attempt at it. These will be the features of it in our recommendation. First of all, we think it should be completely independent of government. And I mean by that completely independent. Because it is a nonsense, isn't it, to say that the media are there to keep the government honest, yet the government regulates the media. That just doesn't sit well. And I'm not saying that the BSA has ever abused that, or that the government's ever exerted influence of that kind, but the perception is not a great one. So we would take the government out of the equation altogether in terms of statute. There will be no statute setting them up, nor in terms of influence over appointments. But secondly, the new body would have to be substantially independent of the media as well, because just as a government-controlled body lacks confidence, so I would have thought does an industry-controlled body. Industry-controlled bodies, pure self-regulation can work, but the perception is always the same. If the industry has control, there must be lower public confidence. And as we've seen graphically, it's all turned to custard in the UK, where the British Press Complaints Commission, a voluntary self-regulatory body, didn't do the job particularly well. However, it's not quite the same as the government, because the media, the industry, have to be represented on any such body. And that is because you need industry knowledge. So what we are suggesting is that the new body should have a majority of representatives of the public, but some industry reps on it, much as the Press Council now does. And we say that's important both for the complaints adjudication part of it and also the governance part of it. So the governance committee or the governance panel should obviously have media people on it, but they should not be in a majority. So it should be independent. As independent as possible. It should not be controlled by the government or by industry. How would you set it up? And that's a real teaser. I mean, one thing you could do is just to ask the BSA, the Press Council and OMSA to get together and sort it out and join up together. And that would be almost impossible because the BSA is a statutory body and it's limited in what it can do. So we think the best way is to have a completely independent working party chaired by the Ombudsman or an Ombudsman's nominee, a group of, say, 7 people, consulting heavily with industry, talking to the current regulators, the Press Council, OMSA, BSA, taking the best of all of them, and creating a brand new body. So we're recommending an independent working party set-up body chaired by an Ombudsman's nominee. The Ombudsman being independent of both industry and government. Now the body would have jurisdiction over news, current affairs and commentary on those things. We have not been asked to look at the entertainment industry, but I'll have a little bit more to say about that. But we are talking simply about the news media, the provision of news, current affairs and commentary. But we're taking a very generous view of news indeed, and I think you have to. The Privacy Commissioner does. We think news is anything which purports to be a factual account and or which involves real people. Because if you have a purported factual account and it's not accurate, somebody ought to be able to complain about it. If it involves real people and they've been unfairly treated or their privacy has been invaded, they should have a right to complain to it. This is all about proper journalistic standards and the provision of factual information. Now, there will be 1 or 2 awkward points at which you say, is this pure entertainment or is it news? It's very easy to set up protocols between the various authorities to sort that out. But we think the whole entertainment provision industry needs a review as well. We are recommending that also, but that's not within our scope. We think the new body should be completely transparent. It should advertise its own existence frequently, tell people how they can make complaints easily. The various members of the news media should have to announce its presence and the way to make complaints in the way that the BSA now does. One of our worries is the Press Council is still a little less well publicly known than it should be. Well, what would the new body do? First of all, it would formulate a code of practice. And to do that, it would take the best from the existing codes, but would consult heavily with industry and the public before doing so. I mean, in any code, there's a lot of well-standing, long-standing and well-understood principles that you'll have in any code. Now, things like correcting mistakes, separation of fact and opinion, treating interviewees fairly, no deception, and so on. I mean, they're worldwide. They're centuries old, so they would be there. You might have to have a few separate sub-clauses to deal with the different types of media. Pictures do speak differently from words. You may have to say a few things about pictures as opposed to words. Bloggers may need to have, if they join this, they may need to have a little clause about themselves as well, because balance is a thing that they're not particularly good at, and nor should they be. Really, it's not their job to be. So within these general overarching principles, there may need to be some, I won't call them sub-codes, but sub-principles, which deal with the various kinds of media. They would hear complaints from the public and adjudicate on them. We've thought a lot about remedies and sanctions. In the end, we do not favour financial sanctions. We don't think money awards are great, because once you get that in the picture, you get legalism, you get lawyers being dragged in, and cases stringing up. And to affect the big broadcasting and the big newspaper corporations, if you had monetary sanctions, they'd have to be big. And Leveson recommended fines of up to £1 million. We did consider this, but rejected it. So the sanctions and remedies would be things like takedown orders, just a statement that they've infringed, which sometimes is enough, corrections, apologies in some cases, giving people a right of reply. In very, very serious cases of flagrant or continued misbehaviour, you might have to consider ejecting the person from the system altogether and actually removing their membership. That would be an extreme case. We also think that any regulatory authority ought to be more than just a complaints body, and we'd like to see some sort of oversight function as well, where they do research on public opinion, they do surveys, and write reports on perceptible trends. And they might even say, we note some trends in headlining we don't like very much. These would not be complaints, these would just be the results of research and oversight of the media industry as a whole, to keep themselves in touch really with the context and what's going on. We're also quite attracted to the idea of the body having a mediation role. Defamation is a horrible cause of action. Some of you may be familiar with it on one side or the other, but defamation cases can string on for years, they cost huge amounts of money, and in the end there are no winners. How good it would be if we could have a system whereby at an early stage a complaint against the media body could be adjudicated within the system and mediated so the parties reach an acceptable conclusion to both of them. It won't always work because when positions get entrenched, it's sometimes very hard to move them. But some kind of facility like that would be, what we think, will be very helpful. We say that with caution because mediation will be a long drawn-out process too, and it's not without cost either. The Leveson report in Britain recommended an arbitration system with considerable penalties if you didn't use it, exemplary damages against you if you didn't use it. We're not going that far. Big question of funding. Who's going to pay for all this? I'm afraid the industry is going to have to bear the brunt of it, as it does now with the Press Council, and it also contributes heavily to the BSA. But we believe there should be a state top-up, and in our issues paper we proposed that, and you could actually feel the bristling of hair as you read some of the submissions, because any suggestion of state funding does raise doubts. But we think the state do have an interest in having a good media, and we'd like to see a relatively modest amount of state funding, but ring-fenced for a particular purpose, and that is doing the surveys and the research. Nothing to do with adjudication. We're keeping the state entirely out of that, but state top-up for the purpose of doing research and surveys, the oversight function, with a clear contract between NIMSA and the state agency concerned that there be no interference in the adjudication process or in the standards or in the codes or anything. We think would take some of the pressure off the media to make what could be quite an expensive process just a little bit cheaper. And the funding of the industry would have to be done on a graduated basis. Big corporations would have to pay more, and little bloggers, if they come in, obviously would have to pay a bit less. But everyone would have to pay some sort of impost or levy or fee. We now come to the hard question. Some of those are pretty hard, but this one is harder. Who should belong? Who should belong to this media body? Who should be subject to the standards it imposes? We had two big choices. Do we make it entirely voluntary? Or do we say some of the media have to belong? Now currently with the Press Council, newspapers do not have to belong, but in fact virtually all of them do. Not absolutely all, but virtually all of them do. With the BSA, all broadcasters have to belong. We have decided in the end to go the voluntary way, and so the system should be voluntary. So media organisations can choose whether or not they will belong. And we've done that for a number of reasons. The main one simply is the newspapers currently have a voluntary system. What's happened since then to make them belong to this? Why should you suddenly change their membership to compulsory? I think also media will better respect the system if it's not forced on them, if they're not required to belong. And I think the public will respect them better too. And then there's the too hard question. If some members of the media have to belong. Where do you draw the line? How do you define that?